So I guess, as I said, I want to kind of cater this session to all levels of expertise. There's going to be people here that are probably absolute beginners, just started out researching their family history, and I'm assuming there's going to be a few of us with a bit more experience. I'm probably in between. I've researched my family tree, my family history, but I can learn a huge amount more. So my first question, and I like to start with this question, Nick, is what actually got you started in genealogy? And what was what interested you in genealogy to begin with?
If I'm being really truthful, the answer is work. Because it's a slightly disingenuous answer, because I've always had a passion for this style of history, this bottom-up approach. Right from way back when I was at school, we did this field experiment because it was as the curriculum was changing, and they wanted much more investigative work rather than recite by rote. And so we went out to research the history of a street, which meant going into the library, talking to local residents, looking at the architecture, a real grounding in hands-on history. And that's always sort of stuck at the back of my head, the sorts of history you don't see in the textbooks. But I mean, look, I'm a mainstream but niche academic historian at heart. 13th century state finance is my thing. So trying to carve a career out of that is really tricky. I got into genealogy off the back of my BBC work, which started off as house detectives from the late 90s, early 2000s. Moved to a couple of other projects, and then they said, look, we're doing this development piece. We think family history is interesting. There's lots of people doing it. How do we make a program? And through various bits and pieces to and fro from the production company and the BBC, Who Do You Think You Are was born. And I was invited to come and do the archive research, spin up a team, create the researchers, and just go and research the celebrities. That was the first time, this is a really terrible confession, that was the first time I'd done any proper genealogy.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I just love that approach that you can
Yeah.
step into a place and pick up someone's life story, dust it down, put it back together, put it into context. That's the thing I think that's really got me interested in this fusion of researching people with places, with the societal history that goes around it. Because you can research a person and it's just an assemblage of dates and facts and figures. You can research a property and it's when stuff happened. Put the two together and do some local and social history, then you're telling a story. And that's the bit that I love. So for me, the spark was lit, yes, through the program, partly through this love of researching. You go into an archive, you never know what you're going to find, and you're finding new stuff out all the time. So as a historian, that's really curious. But it was this spark about animating people in a way that you don't tend to find on traditional history programs. It's about the great and the good and the politicians and the aristocrats and the kings and queens. Top-down history. For me, this forgotten story of everyday lives, and I use that word everyday with great reservation because everyone is extraordinary in their own way, but being able to reach into the past and bring these people back and just dip into their lives, that is so exciting. Really interesting stuff.
Really is fascinating. You mentioned that it's only recently, well, not so recently, but later on in your career that you got into genealogy. Why wasn't it? I mean, were you taught it in school? I mean, do you feel like that could have been something that would have been better presented in your education? And what was it that that didn't get you into it earlier?
There's a generational thing. I think that when you're a bit younger, it's not necessarily the coolest thing in the world to do.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. And I think that's something we need to really challenge because it is actually fun. If you start talking about it as a detective process, then I think it becomes more exciting. What can you find? Where are the clues? How do I bring all this stuff together? Rather than my great-great-grandfather was born in Belchester in the 14th. Yeah, it doesn't quite come to life. So some of it's presentational. Some of it is how we approach research in general. This excitement. It's not for everyone, but there's something around when you start to lose contact with generations, you want to fill in the gaps. And so I do believe there is something generational about it. That isn't to say that there's a lot of really fantastic younger genealogists coming through, but as a demographic, it tends to be an older audience. And I think that's a real shame. And in many ways, that's where, I'm excited around where the technology is taking us, because we can be creating our family history for tomorrow now. rather than having to go back in time and dust down the documents and try and find these fragments of lives. You think what a transformation the internet has made in terms of access to historic content, but the tools that we've got to gather our lives together, to record our stories, to record the stories of people whilst they're still alive. I mean, how many times has a genealogist thought, oh, I wish I could just go back and ask that long dead person what they were doing on that day? Why weren't they in the house when the census was taken, for example? We've got the power, we've got the tools, we can do that now. So I think it's really interesting that maybe the tools and the technology might encourage a younger generation to do something a bit different to traditional retrospective genealogy in the past. And that might then help connect and stimulate people who haven't got the bug yet to maybe share their stories or just reveal some of the family archives they've been hoarding for all the years because they didn't know what it was or what the relevance is. That I think is the really exciting moment that we've got at our fingertips.
Yeah, absolutely. The UK in general has one of the biggest intergenerational gaps, but I think it's proven that when the younger generation are given the tools or guidance to go out there and capture information from their elders, they are very, they do it, and a lot of people enjoy doing that as well. So it's interesting. You mentioned about the detective kind of side of genealogy. And that's what fascinates me, understanding or finding something that I never knew out about my grandparents or my great grandparents, etc. And I actually watched an interview of you the other day, and you were talking about your great uncle. So
Yes.
it'd be great. I and I said to myself, right, I need to know a bit more about this story. And so if you could share that with us, that'd be fantastic, please.
Yeah, he's someone I never met. He died, there's a spoiler alert, in the early 30s. And he was this shadowy figure. No kids that we'd known of, no stories about him. In many ways, he was more interesting to older generations of my family because there were these sort of vague recollections. But for me, he was just another name. And then came the revelation, based essentially on a speculative search of the National Archives Discovery Catalogue. His name popped up with a file that was particularly exotic. I have worked at the National Archives, I know all the file series, but KV2 was a really intriguing one because it related to the intelligence services, in this case MI5. So I immediately thought, fantastic. My great uncle is James Bond. This is great. And then I looked a little bit more closely about the piece of the series that he was in, and it was MI5 monitoring people. So
Really?
he wasn't working for MI5, he was under surveillance. And so when you go through the file, there's this incredible moment, 14th of July, when surveillance is first imposed on him, which led us to understand that he had formerly worked in the Foreign Office, in the communications department, and had been up to no good. And quite what that no good was only emerged when the research got deeper and darker and the backstory started to appear. It was a really tricky piece of research because a lot of the records from that period of the Foreign Office have been destroyed, I suspect because of his activities. And spoiler alert, the book is available in case you want to read the full story. Plug that. Spoiler alert. He had been selling secrets to the Russians from the late 20s. But he was doing it anonymously to, I think, get some money to support his lavish lifestyle. He had married a widow who was much older than him, who seemed to have had lots of money, but that was all tied up in trust funds for her kids. So they wanted to live this luxurious lifestyle, but there was no cash, and his salary wasn't enough to support him. So he sold this stuff to the Soviets.
Data.
Yeah. But then when they blew his cover, they worked out who he was. They thought he's even more valuable than we thought because he's an in to the Foreign Office. Long story short, he was sacked, turned to drink. The Russians were squeezing him. And then one day, after the surveillance had sort of tracked him, he appeared dead in his house.
Wow.
Allegedly suicide, but no one quite knows. The Russians blamed the Brits. The Brits blamed, for some reason, the Germans. They weren't involved. Anyway, and that's the story. My uncle, my great uncle was a Soviet spy before the Cold War.
Yeah. And what research techniques did you use while researching this story and your uncle's past?
I went back to basics. I looked at the standard family history. I wanted to get some sense of who he was, where he came from, what his background was like. so that I could establish him and look at his roots. And he came from a fairly humble family background. His parents had moved from the Northwest to London. They were teachers, fairly respectable, but his career was accelerated. So I wanted to know why. He went to a private school and then found another branch of the family who were in the colonial service, and they dropped back and managed to get some money. So the family history really underpinned the story, and it
Yeah.
grounded him in a place and a time. Then I started to look at his career, because the KB2 file at the National Archives had an outline career. He'd gone into the civil service. So I thought, okay, are there any exams? There would have been at that time. Do the record survive? And lo and behold, I had his exam results. So that was quite nice. He'd gone into the army, so tracked down his military service records again at the National Archives before being picked up and getting involved with the peace negotiations. So he was sent to Paris when he came out of military service. He got blown up, so he was a war hero, and I think this was how they rewarded him, giving him this prestigious commission, helping with the peace negotiations in early 1919. So every step was this fusion of family history with context, with some of the international story, and you'd have to go up and down. A lot of it was also secondary reading, because I'm not an expert in early 20th century espionage.
Yeah.
Or the diplomatic corps. So, behind me, I've got a whole stack of books that I've read and picked up. And in there was an interview with the Russian handler that had been assigned to him after the Russian handler had come out of one of Stalin's gulags. He'd been imprisoned. And so there was this fantastic transcript from the other side, which is in no other archive. So you have to really get into the story, get into the subject, think round corners, and apply those research techniques that any historian would do. Secondary source reading, primary source, bit of genealogy, international context, and just go hunting for the records wherever you can find them. And there were so few for this period. It was really frustrating. Because it had such a checkered past, shall we say, there were no family archives whatsoever to look at. Normally, if you're researching a family member, there might be something, a photo, a snippet. Nothing at all. It's like it'd been airbrushed out of the family story. And the first time I saw what he looked like was when I opened up that KB2 file, and there was his photo, which had been extracted from a distant branch of the family, which we didn't know about, and also his old passport photo. He looks uncannily like me, which is a bit alarming given what happened to him and what he was up to. You come face to face with your great uncle for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a few uncles like that, and maybe I need to be wary of them.
What do they get up to? Like, what do you need to be aware of?
Absolutely. Have you come across any other kind of extraordinary stories like that? Maybe not within your own family, but speaking to other historians or genealogists.
Oh, all the time. Whenever I do talks back in the old world, we would meet in a room and chat face to face. I genuinely used to say, I could do a "Who do you think you are" episode with any single one of you in the room, because we do all have these extraordinary people. The trick is just spotting and identifying them and bringing them back to life. I remember it was on the spur of the moment. I was doing a piece for, it was a radio DJ, and he'd just sort of thrown something out, and they said, I've got no interest in my background at all. I said, okay, let's have a look. And within 3 generations back, after a couple of hours of searching, just online with all the sources, we found a real story of tragedy where the mother had died and the kids were put into the workhouse really early, and they'd had all these conditions, and it had been inspected, and the conditions were appalling. And so that was really a shock, because the story in this guy's family history was that he was descended from Italian princes. So of course that was completely disabused. Then when I looked on the other side, by finding a gateway ancestor, someone who is known and is researched, we found he was connected and descended from Edward I. So he was royalty, but not in the way he thought.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I'm not as hung up about finding a royal connection as some. I like finding, as I said, those moments that you would never normally expect to find unless you go looking for those records. And there's all sorts of moments where you find bigamy and illegitimacy and scandal and crime and criminality, and there's actually more of that than you'd expect. But often it's those humble lives that I find the most extraordinary, because no one bothers to think about what it's like. Agricultural labourers, I'm sure we've all got them in our family. And as soon as you find ag lab on the census, you can almost hear the collective, oh, it's an ag lab, and the shoulders slump, and you think, oh, good, how am I going to find this? Actually, there is so much that you could learn about the agricultural labourer. What was their working conditions like? What sorts of tools and machinery might they have used? Was there some sort of local circuit, some microeconomy they could have been involved in? Where were they living? Who were their circle of friends? Did they itinerate around because they had no fixed home? What was the manner like? What that sort of micro history, as the phrase is fascinating, because they're airbrushed out. It's like I was saying previously, and it's those ordinary lives made real that makes them extraordinary. So I just find
Absolutely.
those little nuggets that you would never normally see. It's storytelling, isn't it? You're
Yeah.
telling the story that no one else tells.
And that's it. We have the same where we believe that, that it's the ordinary people that become extraordinary. And quite often it's sad, but quite often most people don't realize it until it's too late. And that's why it's important to record lives now. You're not only your own story, but your loved ones.
If I could just share a story on that level, I love telling stories. Sorry, and I'm terrible. Tell me to shut up, Mike. If I'm going on too
keep
much,
going.
I'm keeping you off wherever
No,
your
keep
voices
going.
go. But there was a project, and this goes back to the point about a younger generation and tools and technology. There was a project that a friend of mine, Colin McFarlane, an actor, had set up called Making History. And the idea was that if you give kids the right tools and the right motivation, they will tell extraordinary stories. And there was this one guy, who, to be fair, wasn't necessarily enjoying school, didn't enjoy the teaching techniques, but he just, it was like it lit him up, this idea that he could sit down and talk to his family. And for whatever reason, his family never talks about the past. So he recorded them, and he interviewed his dad, saying, "Yeah, so where, we live in Lincoln. Where are we from? And his dad said, "Well, you're Irish." And he said, "What, Irish? No, you never said that." The guy's called Liam, but we'll leave all that to one side. But 2 generations back, in the 70s, so it's not going way back into the mist of time, in the 70s, Liam's granddad had been working in a pub in Derry, during the Troubles. And one of his regulars just nipped outside, said goodbye, turned him a shot. And that made Liam's granddad decide, this isn't safe to bring up a young son. Got in the car, packed all their possessions, drove through the night, got to the port, ended up in Liverpool, carried on going, ended up in Lincoln, settled, didn't speak about it. And this was the first time he found this. And, it was really emotional looking on screen as Liam's dad was talking about this. And Liam then persuaded his family to go back and visit the same places. And because he's a creative lad, he then overlaid that with newsreel footage and some really haunting local folk music. And he created this powerful film that told a story of the Troubles through a family's journey in a way that left the audience, genuinely moved to tears. We'd screened these films at the British Film Institute in London. And the power of that storytelling, a very, standard story, through the eyes of a younger person, but through that oral history leading to records, leading to ancestral tourism, if you want, visiting the place, brought it all together. And that little insight into one family's experience of the Trouble gave people far greater understanding, proximity, empathy, call it what you will, than any professionally commissioned piece. It was incredible. That's the sort of power that these ordinary lives made extraordinary will have.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of just it all goes back to family history and education, I guess, and encouraging the younger generation to be part of this and understanding. There's a lot of social and economic benefits to the younger generation, understanding their heritage. And so what role do you believe family history has in education?
I think it's really important, but it does come with some challenges, because as we know, not everybody has a story that they feel comfortable about researching or sharing. They might come from a broken family, they might be fostered, adopted. There's all sorts of challenges. We can't just say, let's go do family history and it's all going to be good. But it does allow an approach to who you are. And actually, many of the groups that I've just mentioned have support, which is akin to a sort of profiling of background and understanding and access to one's identity, that is very close to what I would call a modern style of genealogy. This also, I think, plays out particularly well, this storytelling approach, when we work with communities with lots of different migrant stories. I'm thinking of this Making History project again,
Yeah.
where we went into schools in London, and you'd have classes of 30 where there were 21 different languages and 21 different migrant stories. What they shared in common was the classroom and the patch of land. And actually, it was a very different style of family history that I think lit up that room, because it was experiential. And it wasn't necessarily about talking around one's family connectivity. It was often some of the cultural family history that was being brought down into that space. So one of the films was around traditional dress, and because 3 generations had moved across, or 2 generations, and now the 3rd generation was going to school, having been born in Britain, they were able to reflect on their parallel lives. So if my family hadn't moved across, by now I'm 12, I'd have probably been getting ready to get married. And it's just little insights like that, that cultural connection in schools. It doesn't have to be, right, now we're going to go onto Ancestry or Find My Past or Family Search, and we're going to build a family tree. There's this wonderful sort of cultural family history that firstly allows us to understand different contexts and stories. That is so powerful. And I think we can all learn from that approach about how we approach history more now than ever, with all of the challenge to the traditional white Anglo-centric view of history in our schools, and the fact we airbrush out all of these other experiences to the detriment of the people who feel that they've been excluded, and to the societies that are now having to wake up to this approach. It gives ownership, it gives empathy, it gives a real sense of belonging, that all of our stories matter, just because it doesn't necessarily map onto this narrative that's here at the top. Actually, all of our stories matter. It's a really democratic approach to seeing that patchwork approach of how we form communities, then they form nations, and it's really compelling. And that's why I think it's important that we take this approach into schools, rather than what I would call, that traditional nuts and bolts, let's go back 30 generations. So I've been talking all day. If my voice
Do you
stops,
want to get some
it's because I've
water?
been in meetings. This is
water.
water. I know my uncle was a Soviet spy. This is not vodka or anything else. But I will have to sort of pause every now and again just to lubricate.
No, absolutely. But family history in schools is, as I said, is so important. I was actually in Canada, Summerside, at the beginning of the year, and one of the secondary schools there, they run a social study program where they get the children to go out into the community and interview a lot of the older generations, and it was fantastic, the information they were gathering. Quite often the conversations would kind of go off on a tangent, but still it was engaging and closing that intergenerational gap, and they were learning a huge amount. And there's, I think I told you before, Nick, but there's a gentleman in America called Steve Franklin, and it's a fascinating project. Now, just for the audience, I'll let them know. He's running this current project, but the story is he met this lady who was 94 years old, and he got along with her really well. And she said to him, when I turn 100, I'm going to invite you to my 100th birthday party. And they didn't actually talk that much over the next 6 years, but sure enough, 6 years later, he received an invite through his post. And so he flew across America and went to this lady's birthday party and danced the night away with her and her family. And he got along with her so well. He thought she was such a fascinating person that he decided he wanted to interview her. So he came up with 100 questions and sat it down and recorded this interview. And he asked her every single question. And he learned so much from that one sitting that he decided he wanted to interview every centenarian in America. And so he's up to over 500 now. And he's archived all of these videos on a website called 100wisdom.com. But what he's doing now is using this archive for the good, for gathering knowledge and understanding how they've lived their lives, and there's quite a few common traits through that centenarians experienced, and it's fascinating. But it's this kind of knowledge that can be used in schools and for the younger generation just to learn and develop from.
I think that it's really powerful. It can be used in schools. It can be used as academic research. There's that fusion between schools into HE, higher education, that often gets lost, and there's so much that we could learn from our family history and communities about providing new stories. I was really struck about the impact that this approach can have on younger people. Again, I'll share another story. This isn't necessarily a family history story, but I think it has enough elements to make it relevant. So Ryde is on the Isle of Wight, and it's got a cemetery, and the cemetery was being vandalized. And a lot of the local residents were really concerned that the kids were just using it as a hangout because there was nowhere else to go. And they wanted to capture the names of the people on those headstones before they were eradicated. So they got a little bit of money from the council, a couple of thousand, no more than that. And they ran a transcription project, and they captured that data. And then they published it. They published it on their own website, not sold it off to another organization. And they wrapped it around with a bit of social history. And they found that as a result of doing that, large numbers of people were now booking in to Ryde, not during the peak season when all the tourists and the music festival folk were there, but actually in the shoulder and off-peak season to come and visit the community, not just to see the grave, but to understand the context. So they created their own mini ancestral tourism economy. And that was then showing that there were greater hotel bookings, greater restaurant bookings. The local council set up and thought, this is good. And then they decided to renovate the two chapels in the graveyard so that these people had a place to go. And that's where the social heritage group were formed, and they were able to then populate that with stories. But then the other one was turned into a graveyard classroom. And the kids were brought in and they were taught not just family history, but local history, but a whole range of other skills: numeracy, literacy, creative writing, ICT. They did nature walks, they did art lessons, and they really showed the value of this resource. And immediately the vandalism stopped. Everyone loved it. I mean, who wouldn't like a day out of the past in space? Which then allowed the younger folk to be exactly those sort of volunteers to go and help create oral histories from older folk in care homes, which then formed part of the website, which then brought more people in. You had Pumpfind, this incredible social engine that showed young people the value and benefit of treasuring these assets, but got them enthused in history and then created more content. An amazing project.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. We need something like that done this way. But but in terms of being a bit more kind of present, COVID has obviously affected education, affected schools, and the lives of children recently. For my son in particular, he's almost forced him to understand a bit more about the family. He's talking to me a bit more when I get him off his mobile phone, that is. But what, in your opinion, how do you feel COVID's affected family history and the interest in family history, I guess, and how do you see it being reflected upon in the future?
I think this is one of those moments in history where generations to come will be asking, what did you do during the pandemic? And in many ways, we will have some of that information in the form of social media and some of the rich media content that schools have now encouraged our young folk to create about us, diaries, for example. And we have, I think, and I can only talk from, personal and experiences of friends, talk to each other a lot more than we ever used to. We've stopped taking each other for granted. It's been challenging. There's a huge issue around well-being and mental health, an even greater issue around the impact on the economy. This is all still to come. This is before we've even really worked through the current implications of lockdown and the clinical side of the pandemic. This is all still to come because we know what happened after 1918-19 Spanish flu pandemic. We can see some of those echoes through history. But I think what it has done is get us talking and getting us appreciating those moments that we had. The fact that you couldn't go and see family for months, couldn't hug people, still can't in certain circumstances. I don't think we'll ever take people for granted again in the same way. I now, FaceTime my mum every single day. And normally I might pick up the phone to her once a week because we'd see each other at weekends. You took it for granted. And now I think, we are sharing some stories, and because we've had to cancel our holiday abroad, we're now looking at something that's a bit more relevant and meaningful. So we might do days out. We want to take a trip to Norfolk, where her side of the family comes from, visit some of the ancestral places. and the kids are more interested. They are asking us more questions. The flip side is that they're using their technology an awful lot more. I mean, I haven't been off a screen hours at a time,
Yeah.
but I think it's about how we encourage them to challenge us about what's relevant. What they find interesting might not be what we find interesting. I was always struck, even before the pandemic, about the way their handling of history was very different from ours. And one of my kids asked me if I remember the war. And I was a bit taken aback by that. I said, "What do you mean, Falklands War? Yeah, I remember that." No, the Great War. Like, how old do you think I am? You know, seriously, how old do you think I am? They've got no sense, but they at least they weren't asking those questions. They
Yeah.
really upset my mum when they asked her if she needed Florence Nightingale from the Crimean War. But you know, it's that sort of. I'd rather have that curiosity
Yeah, absolutely.
than not, and I think it is about encouraging them to see our experiences as history. There isn't anyone in secondary school who can remember the fall of the Twin Towers. You know, they're all now at university.
Yeah.
Scary thought. You know, it's still
Yeah.
fresh in my
Yeah.
mind.
No,
But
mine.
these defining moments, they're only now really captured in newsreel footage. There's far more media, obviously, but in our minds and in our experiences. And so we're encouraging them to ask us more questions. But yeah, I am concerned about, you know, what the disruption COVID is going to have on our communities, particularly the most vulnerable people. And we do run the risk of losing something precious amidst all the turmoil that I suspect is to come. I might be wrong. I'd like to be wrong. And
Mm.
that's, again, why we need more of these social projects that allow us to reconnect with each other, with our place, our relevance, and make sure that we're using tech appropriately to capture these moments. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, not just because you're hosting it, I genuinely think Reliving is just a fantastic opportunity to do that. It genuinely is that sort of feeder into a people's archive, into community groups, into capturing these moments that, you know, 100 years ago, if we'd have had this stuff around the time of the first great pandemic of, you know, this sort of period, we'd have known pretty much what to do. We'd see all of these problems. We'd understand the experiences. We might have preempted some of the mental health problems. I don't know. It's just an interesting thing.
It really is, and in one side you've got, I think almost all generations are using tech more throughout COVID and lockdown. They've had to almost in a way to communicate with other people, other households. But then you've potentially on the other flip side, you've got the kids that are just glued to social media because that's the only way they can communicate. So it's difficult. I'm unsure how it will,
Well,
but for sure, I mean, from what I've seen and within the people in my network, they've definitely been a bit more interested in their family, and you nailed it on the head there, where you said that you just can't wait to go and give your mum or your grandparents a hug, and that in itself is that's kind of spot on, really. That you talked about, we need more societies and more historical societies or heritage societies. Are there any current ones that you'd think that you can advise our audience to potentially be part of? And any societies that would help them in their search for family history or genealogy?
there are three groups I think we should talk about. One is the Family History Society movement, and the Family History Federation is the umbrella organisation where you can find out where the nearest Family History Society is to you. So there's that sense of meeting up with like-minded folk who are fascinated by the past, but also you'll find them around the country, around the world, so you can get into that local expertise if you need help researching your family. But I also like to promote, alongside the family history groups, the British Association for Local History, because you can't do people without place and vice versa. So there's some really interesting groups out there who are looking at local history and heritage on the ground, literally often on the ground, you know, archaeology. Oral History Society, fabulous for getting techniques about how you record stories, how you access oral histories. And for me, one of the really interesting networks is the Community Archive and Heritage Group. And these are looking at really small community archives that are gathering together a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, you can only describe it as stuff. It can be personal memorabilia, it can be objects and artifacts, it can be media clips. It's just really rich. But what I love about them is that it's often the sort of constituency or group or community that are excluded from state archives. You know, you'll find stuff nowhere else. There's some brilliant examples there. Colourful Heritage, who are based in Scotland, Glasgow, I think, and they have chronicled 2-3 generations of oral history from Ugandan Asian refugees or migrants who've come into Scotland, established their community. You won't find many records, but you'll find this rich bank of interviews where they have taken the time to sit down and understand what experiences they faced when they first came into that community. Wonderful stuff. Lots of other examples of those micro histories, micro communities that have self-organized their archive, given themselves a voice because no one else is giving them that opportunity.
I've browsed that website myself, and it's fantastic. There's hundreds of archives that I didn't know existed, to be honest. So,
well, there's sort of a fusion between archives, museums, and mini libraries. You know, they don't really care what they call the institution. Archive just happens to be the word that they're using. But again, I think that sort of terminology doesn't help. If they've had to do things slightly differently to the state system, it's because their collections don't fit, their protocols don't fit. The more we try and squelch them into conformity that doesn't give them the freedom to tell their stories in the right way, you lose that. They won't do it. And there's a real lesson there about that ground up approach. Give them the tools, though. Give them the tools and a little bit of cash. They go a long way, like the Ride Social Heritage Group. They built on a couple of thousand. And there are so many of these projects. But then Gwent Reach is a wonderful example where the local community have been reflecting on their own stories and have been creating a, sort of like a micro museum. But again, it's far more around community engagement, social history, family history, gathering the stories of the residents together so they haven't lost that. Wonderful stuff. It's all going on out there, and it all sits just to one side of the normal infrastructure we would go to when we're looking for information.
Absolutely.
So all of those organizations will help you find the materials that just simply aren't going to be online and aren't necessarily going to be in the local library or the county archive.
But you're right that those local community archives, they don't have a huge amount of funding, if any, at all. And I think what they need is just people. They need people to be part of the groups, the community archives. So everyone that's listening, please go onto the Community and Heritage Archive website, have a browse, have a look for your local community archives and reach out to them. It's really worth doing.
They need peoples and platforms, volunteers to contribute or provide some support. But I think it is, you know, if we are going to change the narrative of our collective stories, which we call history, at a national level, we are going to have to find a way of bringing these resources together so a new generation of, you know, academic historians can gather this hitherto lost story of us, of our people, of our nation, of our communities, so that they can then start to rebalance the history books. So they need access to this stuff too. It's not just for us as interested researchers, it's so that we can really recalibrate the story of us. That's really exciting. You know, people's archive, people, whatever you want to call it. That for me has to be a way that we can link all these stories together and give them power and give them relevance.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm just looking at the time. We have about 20 minutes. We have about 20 minutes left. So what I'll do is maybe we can go through some of the questions that were sent in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll see what I can do.
I have six.
Might be on the spot.
This is it. We're going to challenge Nick. So we have. I have 6 questions here, and I'm just going to read them out as they were sent in.
Okay.
And then we can maybe go through them. So, right, the first question is: so I've got back to the beginning of the parish registers, which is 1556, and exhausted early wills. How do I get back any further?
You can go back 30 years because they're 1536, but leaving that aside,
okay,
so typical medieval historian point of technicality. Okay, it's to have got back that far. Firstly, is an extraordinary achievement, and provided all the links are verifiable, then that's quite something. But a lot will depend on the status of the people that you're researching. We talked about manorial records earlier, and that is the way that society was organized pretty much from 1066 after the Norman Conquest to as late as the 1920s. So manors and the local administration of manors for most people were the way that local communities would organise, with the lord of a manor and land parcelled out to tenants and subtenants, and people would then work for those tenants. That's how things worked. And the manors would then get brought together into great estates. So the records, the administration of how all that worked are kept. Usually in county archives. There's a large collection at the National Archives. Some are in private hands. There's a manorial documents register, which you can access via the National Archives website. And this will take you to all of the administrative records where names of people are kept in prodigious, prolific numbers. If you had someone who was a manorial tenant, if they held land according to the customs of the manor, without getting too technical, they had to apply to the courts, the way that everything was administered, to be admitted as a tenant. So there's a record of that, but it will often refer to the last time that land was held by the family. So you can, and I have gone into one of these manorial records and found the descent of land through the same family 300, 400 years. And many of these predate the 16th century, quite a lot do. And there were all sorts of other records as well that will help you with this. Lots of the government records of the time are stuffed full of the names of our family, often with pedigrees and connections. Legal records, vast amounts of disputed wills and inheritance that you're going to find in some of the central government and royal courts, Court of Chancery proceedings, vast amount there. The Crown would often interact with local communities, and people would come forward as witnesses, or inquiries would be held. Like I said, status is key. If you were a major landholder, you may have an inquisition post-mortem, not to find out how you died, but to find out what land you held and what rights the Crown could then extract in terms of money. So there's a vast amount of... Seriously, right, we could spend an hour talking about how you research ancestors before the 16th century. That's just a flavour. There's a lot of stuff online. I would suggest, go to the National Archives. There's quite a bit up there. Go to county archives. They'll help with some of those manorial records. There are various books and publications, but yeah, there's a lot there you can do. But it does depend on status. And also, I think, the further back you go, you have to be really careful, because there was no consistent spelling of names or places.
Right. Okay.
Lots of the records are in Latin. The dates aren't necessarily uniform, so you might be talking about someone who might have died, but because of the way the records, you might think there were a whole bunch of stuff like that. So handle with care.
Yeah. But maybe I could put some more information on the Reliving website to answer this
Help with
question.
that.
That would be great.
I've got a slide deck that I can make sure it's suitable for publication and
Fantastic.
pick that up. So yeah, I have to share some resources.
That would be great.
At the very least, some links. I've got some resource packs that I can share with you and the folk listening.
Great. So the next question we have was, how might I research possible ancestors in France who might be Huguenots, or if you want to Anglise it, it's Huguenots, who fled during the 16th century?
Okay, so I've got Huguenot ancestors. There you go. There's the Huguenot Society has gathered together family histories, pedigrees, and associated material, wills, records of worship. Although some are with non-conformist registers. They have a library which is part of the special collections at University College London. Those records, this isn't a National Archives show, but they're at the National Archives. You can access them there. That will give you the pedigree of folk in this country, but possibly a link as to when and where they came over. A lot came over after, let me get my history right, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, 1682. I might be wrong about the date, been a long day, there or thereabouts. Fleeing persecution. An earlier wave came over in the 16th century, again during the French Wars of Religion, when Catholics were fighting Huguenots, and lots of people came to this country because we were seen as a safe haven. So this story about migration has always been with us. Those are the sorts of records you could look at. Getting back into France is potentially more challenging, but just like here, we have regional based surnames, so the Huguenot Society can help you track some of those surnames back into particular regions of France, and their archive system is broadly similar. There's the Archives Nationales in Paris, which is the National Archives. You've got lots of departments in France. They will have their own regional archives, and sometimes you may find local archives as well. So I would heartily recommend trips to France. I'm very happy to go to France on your behalf. Make sure it's the south of France with a nice expenses budget. I'll go and do the hard yards.
We may have to drive over, but
may have to, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's great. No, thanks. And the third question would be, I'm trying to make a link between my Jacob family and the Quakers.
Oh, right.
We've
Okay.
always been told this is where our family come from. How do I research this, for one? And so they said they've contacted the Quakers, but unless I have some information, they won't help.
Okay. So, if they've contacted the Quakers themselves, I would suggest they actually step back a little bit. There is a Quaker Family History Society, and if you contact them, QFHS, yeah, um, yeah, my letter, yeah, qfhs.co.uk, something like that. Anyway, look it up, Google it. There we are. They might be able to help with some of the tips and tricks about getting enough information to get started. A lot will obviously depend on location and what the connective evidence looks like. They may well have some of their own records that they can help with. But as with many nonconformist registers were gathered up in the 19th century, so some of those records are also available on commercial websites, research guides on the National Archives. But try the Quaker Family History Society to start with. That's probably the best place to begin.
Fantastic. Fourth question is advice for looking for a missing father on a birth certificate.
Right. Okay. That's a biggie, isn't it? So we don't know anything about date, and we don't know the circumstances. Okay. So missing father could be for a variety of reasons. It's easy to jump to the conclusion that there's illegitimacy.
Yeah.
It may just be that for whatever reason the father wasn't noted or recorded. Look for a baptism. Look to see whether or not there's a married name linked in there. If the mother is the informant, has she married or not? If she hasn't, and it's far enough back that there is a concern that this was a burden on the local parish, or potentially plural union, you might find that the local folk were trying to encourage a marriage, so it might happen just after the birth. So you might find the name of the potential father there. You could go looking for bastardy orders,
Right.
which would have then compelled the marriage or tried to find some way of extracting money to support the local parish in the upkeep of the single mum and the child. So there's a variety of things there. They tend to be in quarter sessions, so you need to go to the county archive for that. A whole range of things. It would be useful to know what the mother was doing, whether she was in service. The old hackneyed story that serving maid is impregnated by the son of the lord of the manor or whatever. Sometimes you will find that if that's then recognised, you might find through the local estate there might be some provision made through education, through status, through a commission in the army if it's a son. There could be some position found in the household if it's a daughter. Whole range of things there, some clues there, but it is really tricky. I suppose you could almost look for DNA tests if it's more recent and see if you can find other branches of the family that will then connect. There's this huge genetic genealogy field opening up, and people are finding some very extraordinary connections. I've got a story in my own background where my grandmother, illegitimate, we actually did find a father's name. It just turns out to be the wrong father. So we don't
Really?
really know. Yeah, the DNA takes us to one place where the documentary evidence takes us somewhere completely different. So I'm now back at square one trying to unpick that. For a long time, we had a fictitious name on her passport, which isn't anything like the name that's on her birth record.
Yeah.
And that was overseas as well. So it's a whole mess. So I do sympathize. But those are some tips and tricks that, you need to have a little think about.
Yeah,
Depends
absolutely.
on when the record was created. If it's far enough back, you might struggle to make a really clear DNA connection, but you might want to consider some of those other social techniques to try and find something.
Okay, thank you. It's just so everyone's aware, there is a Q&A box at the bottom. If you have any questions that you'd like Nick to answer now, if we have some time, feel free to type them in there while I'm going through. We have another 2 or 3 to go through, but feel free to type in some more questions. I'll see if we have time to kind of answer them. So Nick, the next question, you're going to have to kind of deride yourself, but the question is, because I wasn't too sure, but it says one side of the family appears to be only children, which makes things hard to find.
Okay.
Any tips for only children who have only children who have only children?
I'm not sure what the problem is. If they've tracked only children back, it sounds like they've established the link. The thing about only children is that there may not actually be only children. There might be the only surviving children. And that's a really important point,
I
in that
see.
if you're looking on census returns, you might need to do some pattern searching every 10 years. And it may just be that 2 or 3 children are born and die in that 10-year window. 1911 is a great place to start, because then you will find not only the number of children alive, but the number of children born within the marriage. So then you can do the maths and work out how many have died in this in the intervening era. Again, I'm not quite sure what the problem is, other than it gives you less to go on, in that you don't have any sort of naming pattern. But often, if it is a pattern of only children in a family that is genuine, you often find that there are more unusual middle names often associated with it, to keep the name passing down, because
Yeah.
there's some sort of sense of, well, I'm only going to have one child, I need to get my mother's maternal name in, and bits and pieces. But I'm not sure what the problem is. Whether you've got one, whether you've got 15, you're still going to have to follow the same techniques of
Okay.
genealogy. You just might have less clues to find more uncommonly named siblings, in a sense. As if it's John Smith and Ezekiel Smith is the sibling, then you'd probably look for Ezekiel Smith rather than John, and do it that way. So I can understand how it might complicate, but there are no specific challenges as such. You still use the same. There's no shortcuts, I
Okay.
guess, is what I'm trying to say.
No problem. So, and then the last question we have here that was sent in, actually, there is another one we've just typed in the Q&A. So, is it possible to discuss adoption, and how can you look into finding the birth parents? And what they've elaborated on here is, my friend's grandma was adopted in England, Liverpool. After her parents came to Ireland in the early 1940s, I understand that they came from Ireland to Liverpool to have the child adopted due to laws over adoption in place in Ireland.
So adoption has only been a formal process since the 1920s, 1927 in England, 1930 in Scotland, 31 in Northern Ireland, but I think it's 1953 in Ireland. So and that's only the north. So there's a lot of challenge around when and how you could adopt. So in that sense, if someone's coming from Ireland to England in the 40s, you couldn't adopt in Ireland, so there's a formal process in England. But I guess that's my question in that space. Were they formally adopted? There's a lot of informal adoption that went on before the National Adoption Register was created, and it was often brokered through churches or children's homes, and they probably wouldn't leave a record, or if it is, it's much harder to find. If there is an entry on the Adoption Children's Register, then you will have enough information, hopefully, to try and find the birth record. But the birth record, of course, then in this case is back in Ireland, so you're going to have to try and work backwards as well as working forwards. There is some sensitivity about this. So if an adoption has taken place via the process that was set up for 27, there would be case files and papers held locally. The individual would have a right to access those papers to find out more about their birth parents, but this would have to be done with the right level of mediation and support first. So there is a right to see this, but equally there are steps to protect both parties. So it's highly sensitive. There are various researchers and organisations that will help with this process. There's Jeanette King, who I've worked with in the past, has run Families in Time, and having come from an adoption service background, she now helps people with the research and also that engagement with some of the red tape and the policies and the protocols that you need to go through first. So it is sensitive. It's possible. It does depend on those particular circumstances, whether it's formal or informal. Formal, there's a chance. Informal, I think it will be quite tricky.
Okay. And there's a question that's come in just live now from Adele Black. I have a birth in Northern Ireland in 1852 with the name of the reputed father of the birth on the birth certificate. Is there any way to confirm more details of the father by way of records? And she's elaborating, the child did take the father's surname.
So again, it comes back to marriage. So a lot of the Irish records really only kick in from 1864, but marriages are from 1848. So you might see whether there is a marriage either just before or just after the birth to legitimise the child. I'm assuming this is some form of a legitimacy case. It's hard to tell from the question. But Irish records are more sketchy, and it is much harder because you don't get census returns until 1901. So you might take a punt and see whether the family survived that long. If there's enough to try and get a sense of the social standing, you can go into other records. So Griffith's valuation looks at land holding and it fills some of those census gaps. And there's a lot of records there around townships where people lived. The 1850s is a difficult time because you're still coming out of the worst of the social and the economic impact of the so-called potato famine or blight, with lots of migration, people leaving the countryside to go into towns. So there might have been a movement away from where they had been living before. The other complication is if you're looking for birth, you're actually looking for baptism, and you need to know whether it's Church of Ireland or whether it's Roman Catholic. If it's Church of Ireland, you might have a chance of looking at some of those parochial level records. If it's Roman Catholic, those records are held with the parish priest who may not give you access to them. So there are some routes, but it is very much local research. You have to go local. Few of the records, because they don't survive, are online. So go back to Ireland.
Another question has just come in actually saying that they're struggling to find history in Northern Ireland, and struggling to find the grandmother's siblings, talking early 1900s.
So again, given the political divide in Ireland in the 1920s, you need to go to the south for quite a lot of those earlier records. But there is the Ulster Historical Foundation that looks after the north and has done quite a lot of research, not just in the existing records, but also some of the social history around it. So I'm sure it's the Ulster Historical Foundation that can help with some of that.
Great, brilliant. And that's it. So I think we're on time as well.
That's a miracle.
We're pretty much, we're never on time. So just to kind of finish off with, just to give everyone a bit of an idea of what we're doing at Reliving, we're very passionate and have this passionate ambition to help people record their lives and also the lives of their loved ones. Now, before it's too late, we've kind of touched upon this in this conversation today. Just so all of the audience members, you can download our application through the iOS Apple Store or Android Store, and you can also log in through our the web, which is reliving.co.uk. We have some really good tools for you to record your life and others, such as a daily journal, such as a family time capsule to create your family tree, import it via GEDCOM and share it with your loved ones. But also we have a fantastic interview tool, which brings up question packs that either you can create or you can use from other historical societies, interview your loved ones, and then all of those interviews can be stored and shared with your family members. So please check us out, go onto our website, download the application and have a look. Nick, thank you again so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really insightful. I've learned a huge amount, especially about Northern Ireland and Ireland in general. And thanks to everyone who has joined us today. And we Reliving will be running these monthly webinars. So what I'll do is I'll send you out a notification for our next webinar. Each webinar we'll have a new guest. Hopefully we'll have Nick back if you'd like to join us again.
Very happy to, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll go over different topics. Any ideas? If you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, that would be also fantastic. Okay. Thanks a lot, Nick.
Thank you. You're more than welcome. Good seeing you all.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Okay. Nick, catch you again.
Sounds great. Have a great